And now,
ladies and gentlemen,
please fasten your seatbelts.
Welcome to PreneurCast.
You know, business cards being swapped, beers being drunk.
Can I say a nasty word? Can I say procrastination?
With Pete Williams and Dan Coyle.
how well did that go down?
Talk about that entire thing in a very another rant and soapbox episode if you want to.
Visit us online at PreneurMarketing.com.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another PreneurCast episode with me, Don Goucher, and him, Pete Williams.
Hey buddy, how are you?
I am very well, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well, but I've lost my voice a little bit, which is a bit different for me.
It's very different for you. Luckily for you, though, we have another excellent one of your interviews. So you've already used your voice this week. And who have we got to share?
This week is a conversation I had with Dan Coyle, who's the author of two fantastic books. One is The Talent Code, which is a book that talks about talent hotbeds and what it takes to master a subject to become the very best in the world at it. Another book he wrote, which we do touch on a little bit in this interview as a fanboy, is a book with Tyler Hamilton called The Secret Race, which is fundamentally the book that brought down Lance Armstrong. So we touched on that a little bit purely because of my love of cycling and all things Lance. So that's sort of bit at the end, but the main part of this conversation is all about talent. What does it take to become talented in a particular field, whether it is athletic field or whether it's a field like copywriting or in business or entrepreneurship? So it's a fantastic conversation. We kind of touch on some of this entrepreneurial copywriting type aspects because I think every example, not every example, but the majority of examples in the book and pretty much every interview he's ever done, it's always been about what does it take to master a physical skill. And I thought, let's take this in a different angle and talk about a soft skill and how that applies to the talent code.
And just before anybody switches off thinking, I know the answer, it's 10,000 hours, it's not. Okay, the talent code is a completely different. It does incorporate the amount of time and all the effort and all the rest of it, but Dan's perspective and any study of these institutions and these different types of people and organizations that train people and develop this talent, there's some real important insights. So don't switch off. Do listen in. And by the way, we've got a sweepstake running. How long does it take Pete to bring up Lance Armstrong?
I like it. So, put your guess in the comments before you watch the show. We might even do a draw, actually.
All right. With that, folks, listen to Dan talking to Pete about the talent code.
Dan, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, Pete, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Awesome, man. Awesome. Well, I think, as I mentioned to you earlier, that I think it's a big compliment that, you know, we're having this conversation now 4 years after the book came out, The Talent Code, because it's such a fantastic read and an important read, I think, as well.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. No, it's been fun. When it came out, I didn't think it would be passed around as much as it has, but I keep getting calls from interesting people like you, and it's been great.
Awesome. Well, what do you think actually gave this book the longevity that it has? Because there's plenty of people who have written on similar topics, but this one seems to be the one that keeps on living.
Well, I think it's because it gives people a platform to see in a different way and also to act in a different way. There's a story that we get told about talent. We get told it a million times since we're little, that it's born. It's something, a gene that you have. And, the book tells a different story, the story that the science is telling us now, which is that, you build a lot of it in your brain through certain kinds of practice. And, by connecting the dots, I think what really gave it, where people end up talking, where I get calls from the people at the Navy SEALs or from people from professional sports organizations or people who are professional teachers or professional musicians, is because they already knew all this stuff in a way. You know what I mean? It's it gave a conceptual frame to the behaviors that were already working, and so because that frame is effective, it gets passed around and applied to different things. But I don't feel like I invented anything, but I do feel like I was able to explain it in a new way and give people a way. The funnest part I've had about this book is when you have a room full of like Olympic coaches. This happened a couple of years ago. A room full of Olympic coaches from the U.S. Olympic team and a music instructor, and because of everybody's in the same room, and they start having this conversation about how they design their practice and how they approach their practice and the specific vocabulary they use. And it was like, oh, this is this bridge between these worlds that didn't exist. And that's been the most fulfilling part, because those conversations are fun as hell.
I was going to say that kind of stuff would be really cool. I know you've worked with some NCAA teams and a whole bunch of stuff, and that's kind of would be a lot of joy after the slog of putting a book together.
Oh, exactly. I mean, the conversations that happen whenever I do anything with a book, we always leave a lot of time for Q&A, because that's where the fun stuff happens, where the piano teacher starts talking to the CEO and they realize, hey, we're actually, in a way, in the same business.
So how did the book come about? Because I know you've sort of written about this previously as a journalist, but how did the actual book begin?
It probably began, a couple decades ago with me competing with my two brothers at everything and figuring out how I could beat them and how they could beat me. But it specifically began with a newspaper clip that I got that explained the story of this little tennis club in Moscow that had produced 6 top women players. And I called a filmmaker who had been there, and he said, dude, you have to go. It's crazy. It's this, very beat up old place they have one indoor court, and it's a remarkable place because of the way they practice. And so I did. I got an assignment from the New York Times Magazine and was able to go visit there. And it was just as mind blowing as he had promised. And we've all heard of these places, right? There's a place that produces all the chess champions. There's a place that produces all the baseball shortstops. There's a place that produces all the great violinists. And I was able to sort of, kangaroo, to use the Australian word, I guess, to between these places, and to also visit some of the labs where we're studying skill acquisition and connect the dots between these places. And, I think I covered about 50,000 miles visiting these different places. And what came out is really looking at the patterns that they share.
Awesome. Now, I guess, one of the first things people who probably haven't read the book yet probably think about it when they hear stories like that is that, of course there's going to be one great place in every country that produces the best tennis players and all of the great people with those abilities, which we kind of alluded to earlier, just go there. So of course they're going to produce great people. Like, that's sort of like you have the places where everyone goes to learn tennis or chess or soccer, and you have those sort of institutes. In Australia we have our Institute of Sport, which is the breeding ground for all our potentially amazing athletes across the Olympic sports. Like, how does that kind of play into this? Is there a bit of bias that, really realistically, they're just like all the talent goes there anyway?
Well, they do, but then you dig a little bit deeper and you say, okay, where did all these kids who are succeeding at Moscow, this club was called Spartak. At Spartak, where are they from? It turned out they were all kind of from the neighborhood. Or you go to a Caribbean island that's dominating in baseball. Oh, they're all from this tiny island. So in the cases that I chose, they weren't drawing from these huge populations and just concentrating the existing talent. They were actually developing it in that place from people that otherwise looked pretty normal.
So obviously you talk about deep practice. That's kind of the big thing that the book's all about fundamentally, I would say. And correct me if I'm wrong, but with deep practice, can you explain what that is in this context and how important it actually is to create these talent hotbeds?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, practice is this great vague word that we use a million times in our lives, right? But it's almost a word like eating. Well, in eating, it depends what you're eating. And practice is exactly the same way. You can either practice in kind of very, very efficient, a sort of nutritious way would be the analogy, or you can waste time doing practice. And in the book, I tell the story that sort of embodies that. Actually was an Australian girl named Clarissa who was part of this massive study where they analyzed her progress for years and they videotaped all her practice, and they were able to isolate these moments where she took off, where she accomplished huge amounts, and moments where she didn't. And by looking at those moments, what you see is that the moments where she took off, she does something really counterintuitive and interesting. She focuses on her mistakes. Like, she embraces her mistakes. She uses them as signposts. And when you combine that with the science, what you realize when you really focus on your mistakes and you practice on the edge of your ability, and that's really the core of deep practice, practicing, spending time. Psychologists call it the sweet spot, and which is funny because it doesn't feel sweet. It feels really bad. It feels nasty to sort of be on that edge where you're making mistakes 30% of the time, 40% of the time. But that's where you're learning the most, because every time you make that mistake, you have the opportunity to make a new connection in your brain. You have the opportunity to build a new circuit. You have the opportunity to use that mistake as a signpost, do the right thing. So when you operate in the kind of low zone where you're not really operating on the edge of your ability, as this scientist showed with Clarissa, she's wasting her time. She's just playing the song, not paying attention to what she's doing. She's just not feeling it. And then for this 1 5-minute section, she pays deep attention to her errors, and she improves her learning speed by 10 times. And I saw that pattern wherever I went, where they constantly design the space so that they can get to the edge of their ability, make those mistakes, like tip over, and then use that mistake to guide themselves to the next step and the next step and the next step. And they embrace repetition. And what the science shows us about deep practice is when you do operate on the edge of your ability and embrace repetition. We think of repetition as kind of a drag, as something that's just boring and it's like sweeping the floor. And it's what the science is showing us is that reaching and repeating is the most powerful way to change the wires of your brain. And there's actually this stuff called myelin, which is an insulator. It wraps around the wires of your brain. It makes the circuits fire much more quickly. It makes the signals move much more quickly. So when you talk about building fast, fluent skills, it's very counterintuitive, but deep practice where you spend a lot of time operating on the edge of your ability and embracing those mistakes, not as verdicts, but as opportunities to build a faster, more fluent brain is what it's all about.
Awesome. Now, this is the thing that intrigues me, and it definitely come up in conversations that I've had around the book, is that, the age-old sort of axiom, I guess you'd call it, is like, perfect practice prevents piss-poor performance. So it's all about, doing perfect practice. And that's what sort of builds up the muscle. Now, The thing is that obviously, that makes sense, I think, for me at least, when I think, okay, if I'm doing practice perfectly, I'm going to then obviously build those myelin wrappers and build that wire and that connection better of, doing that free throw the right way or playing the clarinet the right way or whatever it might be. Yep. But then we sort of talk about and hear you saying, and obviously read in the book, that you want to be on your edge and failing a lot. Then there's this counterintuitive thing like, well, if I'm failing a lot, am I just creating the wrong connections in my brain of failure? What am I reinforcing with the myelin here?
Right. It's not failing a lot. It's failing maybe 20 to 30% of the time. You want to be succeeding most of the time. You want to be on the edge, but you still want to be standing in your ability. You do not want to be thrashing around. If you're failing 70% of the time, you're not in the right zone. And attempting perfect practice is a beautiful phrase because it gets you in the frame of mind of constantly think of what that phrase is. That phrase is a magnifying glass to put over your practice that alerts you when you're not being perfect. That's why that phrase is useful. Perfect practice is not effortless practice. Perfect practice is deep practice where you're trained in to look at the edge. And you probably won't accomplish it most of the time. But when you try to and you accomplish it 90% of the time or 80% of the time, that is a beautiful learning opportunity.
Absolutely. And I think that the one thing that you said before is this mundanity of excellence. I think that's a term you use in the book. And I found that was such a brilliant little term because I used to play basketball pretty seriously when I was younger, and practices get repetitive; they do get boring. And do you think that there is a little bit of personal bias that someone has that mind frame to be able to do those 10,000 hours of free throws or 10,000 hours of repeats?
Oh my God! When you scratch the surface of the kind of temperaments that end up succeeding in this stuff, and I would suspect you might be one of them. I mean, you often see a pattern of sort of low-level obsessive compulsive disorder. It's not normal. It's not normal to want to do that. It's not normal to sort of embrace that level of perfection and repetition. It's not normal to want to be Tiger Woods. But you can actually, which sort of speaks to the sort of second ingredient here, which is that sort of ignition where you get this irrational emotional identification with becoming someone that will drive that practice. And it really is the step that comes in a lot of ways before the practice. When you stare at someone that you want to become, when you stare at something that you want to become, you sort of unlock a tremendous amount of motivation to allow you to do that. And, as you point out, it's like, it's not normal to sort of, if you're sort of a normal, happy, satisfied, totally well-adjusted, content human being, you're not going to want to go to that discomfort zone at the edge of your ability for hours every day. And so part of that, if you do want to build skills, the sort of base part of it is you need to really sort of do a reality check and say, okay, who do I want to be? Who do I want to stare at? Who do I want to become in the next few years? And try to sort of ignite that motivational circuitry to fuel that practice. Because as you say, it's neither easy nor completely, balanced to want to obsess about doing that. But we've all had these great moments in our lives where we've been irrational, right? Where we've been totally ignited. And that is a thing to sort of embrace and get control of, not something to fear.
Did you find that when you went to these hotbeds around the globe, they had some sort of either selection bias or some sort of way to manufacture that ignition? Because obviously, I think it's pretty clear to most people that, you can manufacture the requirements of deep practice. But, how do you either select or manufacture this ignition?
That's so funny. I mean, I've been starting to do a little informal consulting with some sporting teams, and that's the question that they're obsessed with in some ways too. Like, you've got all these kids in the world today, and a lot of them are, they can be very skilled athletes. They can be, and it goes beyond sports. It goes to music. It goes to business. It goes everywhere. They can have all the skills, but do they have the fire in the belly? Do they have that? And the answer I'm seeing is sort of no. You can't fake that stuff. It happens in these sort of very deep subconscious places where you have got people who have got things in their lives or things in their temperament that are driving them, and you can't sort of invent that. You can maybe increase the odds of it happening some, but it is no coincidence that the majority of people who decide to say run for president, are an unusual percentage of them are orphans. That is an ignition moment. Where you sort of realize the world isn't safe, and I'm going to be my ego is going to grow, and I'm going to become a very big, powerful guy, and that appeals to me, a big, powerful woman. So it's difficult. Can you increase the odds of it happening? I think that you can. The phenomenon that I sort of witnessed in the hotbeds was they were really good at filling each other's windshields. When you walked onto that court in Russia, this junky little court, and you knew that Anna Kournikova and Sharapova had played, had stood at this baseline, had played at this net, this very humble place. That was incredibly empowering, and they were not shy there about sort of filling the windshield with that fact and giving younger people the opportunity to really stare at who they might become, and in that way, sort of ignited them.
I think staring at Kournikova would definitely ignite me. but like, I guess the thing is that you mention and you talk about Tiger Woods quite a bit, and you've got this awesome thing where you sort of, I guess, demonstrated this process where you actually learnt to do the similar thing that Tiger did with the golf ball bouncing on the club in the Nike commercial he did a few years back,
right? Which
I thought was really cool. Right. The question I have around that is, obviously everyone knows the Tiger Woods story that when he was, 3 or 4, his dad, basically shoved the golf club in his hand. Yep. And, something that I've always wondered is like, how much of that was, and I guess he's probably very similar to, like, if you read Open, he's very open, pardon the pun, about how much tennis got shoved on him as opposed to something that he actually loved. So like that sort of intrigues me. Like, what's your take on those two characters in that they've both basically somewhat said that, the sports they became the best in the world at was forced upon them as opposed to being ignited inside them? Yeah,
right. It is a very sort of it's a group process. It shows how interconnected we all are, I don't think, and I think it's true in all of our families, there's no 5-year-old in the world who says, oh, I really want to grow up and play violin. That's the parent is always part of the conversation, and the parent always has to be there to either enable or say, no, we're not doing that, and guide. And so it really is when you see any kind of success, what you're really seeing is a community of people. And sometimes that community can be bullying. In the case of Andre Agassi, sort of as an aside, I don't know if I really buy in Open how he talks about how he hates tennis. Nobody can be that good and play that often and genuinely hate it. He didn't play like a guy who hated tennis. But I do buy that he's conflicted about it. And I do buy that Tiger Woods is also conflicted about it, but it really goes to show how we really are products of our larger social fabric and the huge role that these people in our lives, the other people in our lives play at developing our skills. And places that approach and embrace these sort of communities end up being places that produce more talent, that kind of welcome the family and welcome the support system and don't just treat the person as an isolated island.
Very cool. Now, I'd like to sort of take a bit of a shift here, and I obviously recommend people check out thetalentcode.com. You can follow you on Twitter and get a whole bunch of other videos and stuff. So definitely check the website out and grab a copy of the book. But for those people who are listening, who are not sporting passionate, I might use that word, they are the writer, they are the business person, they are the consultant, they are the marketing guy. How does this sort of stuff apply there? Because obviously, the majority of interviews and examples in the book are very much based around sport and talent in that aspect. But, negotiation and copywriting and just writing in general are still skills and talent. So I'd love to kind of get your take on that and hear how you've actually applied this stuff in your writing and that side of your world.
Yeah, I love that. Now, it's interesting. There's a word that's sort of appeared in business in the last 5 years that has probably grown faster. It's been like a virus of an idea that's traveled and actually as a person. This word is coach. And I love it. We didn't hear it that many years ago. Now it's everywhere. We've got coaches everywhere. And I think that's a beautiful thing because it really speaks to the fact that all of these things are sports. All of these things are skills. All of these things are talents that can be grown, as opposed to just being born with. And when you really analyze what's happening with, say, an entrepreneur, let's do a little comparison here. An entrepreneur has an idea. He's got to move it past these obstacles in a way, and he has to improvise all the time in unexpected ways and over unexpected barriers. The analogy there and the connection, if we can make a metaphor, that is a soccer type skill. That is the kind of skill that you have to get used to understanding what the barrier is and practicing your moves to get around that barrier, whether that move is a change in a shift in tone, whether that move is humor, whether that move is having an assortment of 10 interesting things to talk about to demonstrate the benefits of your idea, whether that move is building a social network big enough to guide you past those obstacles. All of those things are skills, and all of those things are things that a coach-like person in that business can help someone discover. And the other place I see it, an interesting connection, is in something that is used often in music and used often in sports and used less often in business, is the power of a mentor. The power of a mentor. What is a mentor? A mentor is an opportunity to stare at somebody and get ignited by them and picture yourself in their shoes. It's this incredible motivational relationship that you can have. And it's also an opportunity to watch someone work and see their skills in action. In business, there are quite a few tales of CEOs. It's almost a cliche. The CEO who used to work in the mailroom and now is the CEO, right? How many times have we heard that? Yeah. Think about that from a skills perspective from a minute. You're in the mailroom. You are pushing a cart around a place. You're delivering letters and opening the letters, opening the correspondence of the powerful people in the business. You are experiencing a complicated map of that business. You are able to hang around in rooms where people are having important conversations as if you're a fly on the wall. It's the perfect place to learn a business and to have all these people in your windshield as you look at their skills, as you try to replicate those skills and build them for yourself. So it's these same patterns happen over and over again. And I think when it comes to coaching, when it comes to mentoring, and when it comes to thinking about ourselves, not as sort of a natural born business person or a natural born salesperson or a natural born copywriter, but actually taking the time to appreciate the craft of what's going on. All good people appreciate the craft. All talented copywriters appreciate the craft of copywriting. And to look at the best examples of it, you mentioned, talking about writing. I know that I do that with my own work. If I find an interesting sentence or an interesting way to structure a narrative, I write it down. I try to analyze it. I try to break down what makes it good. Those are the same sort of skill approaches that you'd use in any sport and in any music. And I think we underuse them when it comes to business. When you see a great ad, when you see a great bit of marketing, it's possible to appreciate the craft of that. It's possible to find a mentor in that. And it's possible to take a skill-centric approach to getting better and deep practicing that.
Yeah, this is I think you touched on it. Like a lot of copywriters, the copywriting coaches, again, for want of a better term, they recommend people sit down and rewrite out great ads and kind of, actually go through the process of writing it, and that they sort of have this voodoo that, you suck it up. And obviously what you talk about in the book is a little bit more science than just voodoo. Like, what other sort of deep practices have you seen in that sort of, intellectual kind of profession as opposed to the physical profession? Because obviously, pushing your boundaries and practicing, in that on the edge. Like, how do you practice on the edge as a copywriter, as a marketer, as a negotiator? Like, what's some stuff you've seen around there? Is there many examples?
You bet. I've seen a lot of live action rehearsals. You know, live action. It's one thing to say, "Oh, I'm going to walk in the room, I'm going to give my presentation, and I practice it in my head." No, that's not the same. But if you go into an audience cold, you know, friends, family, whoever, and you work through it, it is massively different. It is massively different. And embracing that live action, people that do that. I mean, Steve Jobs in his practicing, or anybody now who practices to give an Apple presentation, those guys are insane when it comes to. It's like a Broadway show. Absolutely. Every hesitation, every stop is every comma is analyzed and rehearsed to death. When you talk about, I was reading about Winston Churchill's war speeches. He's a guy given communication. He practiced those things to death. Every pause, we will fight on the beaches. We'll fight. Anything with communication where you're trying to communicate a message should be treated as if it's a Broadway play. I mean, if you're really trying to deliver it, it's about rehearsing that message and delivering it in a way that you want to deliver it. So things are much more rehearsable in business than we sort of assume that they are when it comes to sales pitches, when it comes to copywriting. When it comes to, you know, I guess writing is something that's near and dear to my heart. And I think I love the idea of, and it's something that happens all the time, where you actually are rewriting those ads actually is, I think, an incredibly useful suggestion. Going through and experiencing the inner logic of them and breaking them down and putting them back together again is massively important when it comes to communications. And another area that I see people maybe not using that could be used more is this idea of stealing. This idea of stealing from other professions, stealing of taking what amounts to field trips. I ran into a group of Green Berets, sort of Army Special Forces guys, who had just come back. They took a field trip and they hung around in the offices of General Electric and they could do it for like a month. They could watch those people communicate. The problem that they were having in the Army was that they weren't as good at communicators as they wanted to be. So they said, look, we're going to go take a field trip here, and you're going to have these guys in your windshield for a month, and you're going to see them write emails. You're going to see them conduct meetings. You're going to see them have difficult conversations. You're going to see them banter with their staff, and you're going to watch these master communicators, and you're going to learn from them. And I think that's a tremendously, when you start to think that you can look diagonally across industries, that maybe the burger joint down the street has something to teach you about how to handle transactions or how to communicate with a customer. That can be a very sort of mind-opening idea, and to take advantage of those field trips, or just become have more like a spy's point of view, where you're constantly looking for the kinds of interactions that you want to get better at, where you're constantly looking for the kinds of communication that you want to get better at, and basically taking notes on them. And, you know, that's another area where I think it's underused. I think a lot of people are not capturing the ideas. That's one pattern that I saw in a lot of the talent hotbeds. They were obsessive about writing stuff down. Oh, everything that happened, about writing things down and capturing them. You know, our brains are built to have ideas. They're not necessarily built to keep ideas. And when you keep a notebook and you start tracking the types of skills that you have and the types of skills that you want to build and the types of skills and people that you admire, you're building a map for yourself. You're building a map for your brain to grow in that direction.
No, that quote just then, our brains are designed to create ideas, not keep them. I think that is an amazing takeaway.
Well, it's you know, how many times do we and now we've got these wonderful tools in our pocket, right? Where we can actually, it's probably easier now to capture them than ever before. So there's pretty much no excuse for encountering something neat and then just walking away from it without finding some way to capture that and then to reflect on it and loop over it a few times and see where it connects. You know, all of this creative communication stuff is all about connecting dots. And the more opportunity you give yourself to connect dots, the better you're going to be.
You mentioned the looping just then. I'd like to kind of go back and sort of talk about that a little bit when it comes to, let's say, you know, becoming Winston Churchill and looking at a speech and getting ready for that. Because I think, you know, some people who have taken a bit of a step forward and they are, you know, preparing for a speech and they're just practicing it and they're kind of talking it through from start to finish over and over again. Would I be correct in making the assumption from the book that the way you really want to get better at that is if you stumble over a particular line in your presentation, as opposed to going, okay, cool, keep moving forward, you should continue to repeat that a couple of times and get that exactly right before you move on. Is that kind of the deep practice methodology?
Yes, that would be a perfectly the right takeaway, to actually celebrate that moment. Like, oh my God, I'm so glad that happened here. And what did that reveal? What moment did that reveal? It may have just revealed that you didn't memorize it, but there also might be. And every time you run through it, you sort of have, when you're in deep practice, you sort of have two brains in a way. And it's weird. This is the way that I sort of conceive of it. You're doing something, but you're also kind of watching yourself do it. You're monitoring your activity. And if you're monitoring your activity, you'll sometimes see opportunities and connections. In a speech environment, it might be a joke or a callback from a previous moment that you could hit. But it's the kind of stuff we're doing here now that we can both sort of be in the moment, but also be monitoring ourselves. And that's the kind of thing that happens in deep practice. So when you and it's also a continual mindset of openness to change, where you're running through that speech. You're not just trying to sweep the floor the same way every time. You're not just trying to execute it exactly the same. You're doing it with kind of investigatory mindset, looking for opportunities, knowing it's not perfect, knowing that you're not perfect, but still open to the idea that, I might discover something or have a thought as I go through it, and it's going to get a little better and a little better. And that's kind of the mundanity of excellence. The accretion of these little moments where you make a small improvement in something. The business metaphor for this, of course, is that Toyota method. I'm blanking on the name of it right now. It's anyway. They've got an incremental improvement method where everyone on the assembly line can make tiny improvements and make tiny suggestions all the time, and everyone's empowered to do that. And that is the way that you build beautiful stuff is through small moments where you're making little fixes.
Awesome. So the website, thetalentcode.com, got some amazing resources on there. And obviously, as I said before, grab the book and follow Dan on Twitter. I'd love to ask you a couple of questions about what you've done since the Talent Code, because it has definitely been great consumption for me in a very different way to the Talent Code. Because you, I'd like to think, was one of the catalysts for the whole Lance Armstrong, recent happenings, to put in a politically correct way. How did you come to end up writing about Lance and then obviously doing the book with Tyler?
Yeah, no, that was kind of a crazy journey. And I guess it is sort of connects back to sort of always being open to stuff. About 10 years ago, I got a call from an editor who said, this Lance Armstrong guy is pretty interesting. No one's ever written a book about him. At the time, I was sort of casting around for a project, and long story short, moved to Spain with my family in the town where the Americans all lived and trained to write about a year in the life of Lance Armstrong and the Americans. I was never let fully into that world for reasons that are obvious now. And I wrote a book that contained kind of all the light and shadow of the moment, the dropping a few hints, but never being completely clear because we weren't really clear at that moment. And then, I guess in about 2011, I got brought back into it. One of Lance's teammates, Tyler Hamilton, who you alluded to earlier, was being investigated along with Lance, and Tyler and I got in touch, and we started spending time together. And the result is a book called The Secret Race, which is the sort of full and complete telling of what really was going on. So I enjoyed the opportunity to sort of see the world twice, sort of once sort of on the surface, and then once with a backstage pass, kind of all you can believe with everything, all the crazy stuff that was happening behind the scenes. And it made me obviously see the sport a different way, but also have a new appreciation for the power of a culture and the sort of power of a group, both in a positive and a negative way.
I'm very conflicted about the whole Lance Armstrong thing. I'd love to have your take on this as much as you can reveal. Is that I think what he did was absolutely wrong, but I can actually understand why he did it. In that when you're a 19-year-old kid and you're put into this world and that's all you've wanted to do for 15 years and you've done your 10,000 hours and you've done your deep practice, and suddenly in this world to become the greatest cyclist of all time, and then this is what people around you are doing, you kind of just accept that culture, and then at some point it becomes bigger than you and it's hard to control.
Right. And nobody would, it is a tragedy if you pull the camera all the way back. And I don't think there's anybody who sort of faults Lance for doing what he did. I think where he crossed a really important line that he doesn't still understand that he crossed was in his aggressiveness and in his sort of venom at going after people who accused him. I mean, so many people were in that position. Tyler Hamilton, who I wrote the book with, was in that position. And when people accused him, he would kind of put his head down because he knew, right? I mean, he knew they were right at some level. And he just sort of tried to change the subject. But with Lance, it's one thing when you start throwing lawsuits at masseuses who don't have means to solve. That's a whole different deal. So, but you're exactly right. I mean, all of us, I think one of the takeaways that I had in spending so much time in that world was the realization, you know what, if I had been in that situation, if I had doped to become a writer and I was 22 and I wasn't sure if I was going to make it, and everybody around me was doing it and all the authority figures were nodding their heads saying it's okay to do, how long could you resist? I mean, you might be able to resist for a while, but I think there's very few people who would be sort of morally strong enough to say no to that for 5-10 years.
I think so too. And it's such a shame, and it's really good the sport's obviously cleaning up, and the times and the speeds are coming down, which obviously hopefully indicates that all this sort of corruption's gone from the sport. But tying this all back into the talent code, if we sort of take away the drugs and take away all that sort of stuff, there is still a lot of work, and people still, certain people say that Lance still worked harder than everybody else. He was still out there training just as hard, if not harder than everybody else. So he was still, doing that deep practice as well as having that little cream on top.
Yep. Oh, there's no question. Those guys all worked insane amounts, and Lance was probably the most insane worker of all, But it just goes to show, the shame of it is, as a sports fan, and I know you're a sports fan, that we'll never know. I mean, that to have the playing field get tipped so drastically and have those gains, those gains don't go away that you get from doping. So to have it tipped so drastically, it all ends up in kind of a gray area where we can't really know what would have happened. Maybe the guy who finished 30th would have won the tour if everybody was completely clean, and that guy, nobody knows his name.
Yeah, and that's the sad thing. The people who are able to stay strong to their ethics, kind of the ones who actually almost got hurt the most in a weird sort of way.
Yeah, absolutely they did. They got sort of wiped out of the sport and left. And only now are they sort of feeling, after 15, 20 years of this, realizing, hey, I made a pretty good choice. I talked to one of them the other day who actually is writing a book about that choice. And he feels these other people, they've got a huge crater in their lives. Even the ones who aren't Lance have I know Tyler still has a lot of struggles in that area, and they had to live in a very nasty world. And it goes to show the importance of culture, the importance of these invisible signals we're getting all the time from those around us, and how important it is to tune into that and to follow it best you can.
Absolutely. Now, do you see a lot of deep practice actually happening in, particularly, I guess, first time round when you're in Spain, living there, writing, I won't say the positive book compared to the Tyler book about Lance and the team, but in terms of just sort of actually seeing what they were doing on a daily basis, what sort of deep practices were they actually doing?
It's even if you, let's sort of, just for the thought experiment, sort of ignore the doping that was going on, which sort of changes what you're able to do and eliminates a lot of rest that you would otherwise have to do. They were very good at designing practices that would push people to their absolute limit, and then the drugs would allow them to keep doing that over and over again. But they were very good, and what's kind of gotten lost in all of this doping stuff is how good they were as an organization, in terms of on the fly incorporating science and tactics and strategy and sort of human element. They were kind of inhuman. They didn't treat people really well in that organization. If you were writing for Postal at the time, if you weren't Lance or one of his couple buddies, you were on eggshells all the time because you didn't know where you stood. They weren't great communicators, but they were incredibly efficient and effective at building a team, and using all the weapons at their disposal to win. The inhuman part of that was this win at all costs mentality, which, I saw firsthand just destroyed all these relationships. And to me, it was a big object lesson in no matter what a beautiful machine you build, you've got to put the people first. And they never did that. And that's what ended up bringing the whole thing down.
This is something that I've always had an internal conversation about, is if you look at most sports, you look at Tiger in golf, you look at Lance in cycling, if you read, you look at Michael Jordan in basketball. I think he was very lucky to live in a world pre-internet and pre-Twitter and pre-social conversations. If you look at NFL football, like every sport, except for pretty much tennis and Roger Federer, every sport seems to have the top 2 or 3 people have some huge scandals on the other side of their life. And it's, in like one of the best footballers here in Australia, Australian footballers, had a huge drug problem come out a couple of years ago and was, quite large. And he said, look, I trained my ass off and trained harder than anybody during the week, which allowed me to consciously have my weekends off after the game. So we play the game on Saturday afternoon, and then I'd just go to town for 2 days and be just a mess. But then I'd, wake up on Monday and I'd just train my ass off again. And it's interesting to me, and I want to know your opinion. Is there any sort of reason that you can see from your experience that seems to be a case in everything? You look at the best politicians, you look at the best anybody, it always seems to have the top 1 or 2% also have huge scandals come out.
Yeah, no. I think it is a definitely a function of the modern age. Maybe this happened back in ancient Greece too. I think it's a function of like anything. There's no simple solution, but here are some factors that I would say are in there. One, they are extreme personalities to begin with. They're drawn to risk. They are drawn to going too far, and that's part of it. Another is that they feel so used by the world and by the media that they're sort of entitled. They're entitled to sin. There's a fascinating element of that. There's a movie called The Armstrong Lie, where the filmmaker Alex Gibney gets into that quite a bit. And this pattern happens over and over again. The good that Lance did sort of enabled him to behave badly. It's like he gets a deposit in the favor bank, and so he gets to withdraw it. That's how our brains are built. If we sort of get a little credit for something, we feel entitled to cheat. We feel entitled to cheat when we've sort of done good work, and that is, I think that dynamic is also playing at it. So no, I think it's fascinating, and it seems to keep repeating itself almost endlessly, and it's two sides of that coin. It's just the two sides of the success coin, which means that I think the more you get and the higher you fly, the more you have to sort of be incredibly watchful of. And we've seen it now with Michael Phelps, who just pulled a DUI and seems to, have some of those same patterns. I don't think, it's easy to leap to the conclusion that these are bad people and they've been ruined. And I think, no, it's more a function of their little microculture that they're in. And it would be really interesting to sort of seek out examples of people who've been able to insulate themselves from those same forces.
Roger Federer, he's just, to me, the poster boy. He just seems to be amazing on every element and just doesn't have any little scratch anywhere.
Maybe that's it. Maybe that's it. Or maybe he's got a secret dungeon that we'll all find out about.
Well, that's the thing. I just keep, I guess the cynic in me keeps thinking something's got to come out because he's just too amazing as a role model. But that's a book, mate. That's a book I would love to see you put together, because I think you have the skills to do it and obviously the access to actually kind of get understanding of the psyche of the two sides. It's almost a two-face approach.
Yep. And both of them are human. It's not. It's easy to villainize these guys. As they're saints when they're on the right side of that, and they're monsters on the other side of that. And to me, the interesting thing is that they're not a white hat or a black hat; they're all a gray hat, and to embrace that humanity in them.
Yeah. Do you think Lance has been persecuted more than he should have in the media since this?
I don't. The highest. What's the saying? Sort of the highest flyers have the furthest to go. He made $100 and some million in this thing. He did not simply deny having done this stuff. He aggressively. So no, I think there's a morality play going on that he's created. So he's the last person, I think, who can complain about being unfairly persecuted.
Absolutely agree. So let me ask you this one final question. It's a question that we kind of ask all our guests on the show here. And, over 4 years since the Talent Code came out, like, what's the one question that either no one's asked you but should have, or that I just simply haven't asked you that I should have about the book?
Good Lord, that's a hard question. Let's see. What would the question that you haven't asked me is how I apply it to my regular life. I should by this point I should be incredibly talented at something, right? I mean, and the question is, what talent do I have? And my answer, what is my answer to that? I think I've become more efficient. I've changed my mindset from being kind of a grinder to trying to be highly efficient and effective. It's really made a change in the way I approach my work. And so it's permitted to me to develop my talent of laziness.
Love it. And I guess, if you had the chance to write the book again, and obviously you've written I guess you call it the companion book, which is the smaller takeaways, which is definitely worth checking out as well. What would you actually add to the book now, given the conversations you've had with these Olympians and these, award-winning athletes and musicians and coaches and things like that? What's the one thing missing that you add if you could again?
Well, it's funny. I'm actually working on a book that kind of answers that question because I kept bumping into this question of culture as I visited these places and what happens. What's the science? What makes successful groups tick? Because I kept bumping into these successful groups and great teams. What makes them bigger than the sum of their parts? What makes them so effective together? How does that get created? And that has actually sent me down on this journey that I'm on now, where I've been visiting these very successful groups, like Pixar, like Navy SEAL Team 6, like the San Antonio Spurs, places like that where they're a great culture. And so I've been, and it's fascinating because so much of this stuff happens kind of on the unconscious level. When you walk into a different culture, things happen to you. You get a sense of belonging and trust and purpose. And I'm sort of diving in with this new project with the mechanics of how that stuff works. And it's been totally fascinating and remains, I'm sort of partway through writing the book. So it remains kind of mysterious at this moment, but it's the kind of mystery that I love because it's just deep and it affects you every day of your life when you start seeing the world in this way rather than treating culture as just, it's luck or, it's just some magic leadership that somebody has. When you really start seeing beneath the surface, the world gets more interesting.
Absolutely. Well, Dan, thank you so much for your time. I know you're a busy man. Thetalentcode.com is where people should absolutely check out the book and obviously a whole bunch of extra resources and videos and blog posts and a whole bunch of amazing stuff on there, Dan. So thank you so much for your time.
Hey, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation, Pete. Let's do it again sometime.
So, like I said, folks, it wasn't just about the 10,000 hours. It was about a lot of other stuff. And not surprisingly, some of that stuff is stuff that we've talked about before. I love this idea, Pete, that he talked about of deep practice.
Yeah.
It was definitely a different thing to talk about, a different perspective on things, yeah?
Absolutely. I think it's a fantastic book. And I'm so glad that Dan was able to make the time to come and chat because I think it is something that is universal and has a long life. As I mentioned in the conversation, it's been 4 or 5 years since the book was released. So to have that longevity, people still talk about it. Like Tony Robbins was talking about it recently at a Unleash the Power Within weekend that I went to. So he still mentioned people are still talking about the power of this book. So it's really, really important.
And there really were just some big takeaways from that. For me, throughout the interview, you asked some great questions. You really got him to drill down, as you said up front. You got him to look at it not just from the sporting point of view, but from really a point of view that's more relevant to our listeners, for the soft skills, the business, and things like that, even copywriting. Some things that really stood out to me though were things like doing live action rehearsals. And he gave examples of people like Steve Jobs and the Apple team when they do their presentations, how they actually treat it like a Broadway musical, which I thought was great. And this idea, and this is something we talk about all the time. He called it taking field trips. But this idea that you can learn from completely different places. And he actually used the American Army, the Green Berets, going to see, was it General Electric?
Yep.
And it's like, if the Green Berets can learn from General Electric, then we can learn from just looking at other businesses, just picking up skills and parallels and stuff like that. So that was, yet again, Pete, another great interview.
Thank you, sir. And we've got some more coming up in the next episodes as well.
Yep, I'm looking forward to you've got some great ones in the bag, plus we've got some people lined up just waiting for that phone call from you. So we're going to be bringing that and more excellent content in the next few weeks on PreneurCast.
See you then.
You've been enjoying another fine episode of PreneurCast with Pete Williams and Tom Gosher. Make sure to hang out with the boys online at www.preneurmarketing.com or drop them a line via PreneurCast@preneurgroup.com.